Thank you. Good evening. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you, and welcome to the National Opera Center on this rainy, cold, nasty evening. And to those who are joining us on the live stream, be happy that you're not outside on the streets of New York. Welcome wherever you may be. This is the last event, our last public event of the 2016-2017 season. Thank you for being with us through our composers in concert, our emerging artist recitals, and our conversations. You'll hear about the next season very, very soon, and I assure you it's a really, really good one. Conversations is a series where we learn from luminaries in the field about their careers, their current and upcoming projects, and the advice they have for aspiring artists. I first heard Renée Fleming in Omaha, in Donizetti's Maria Padilla with Opera Omaha, which was, I think, in 1990. It was a rarely performed Donizetti opera that remains rarely performed despite her spectacular performance in it. The next time I heard her was in 1991 at the world premiere of The Ghost of Versailles, in that wonderful production directed by John Conklin and designed by John Conklin and directed by Colin Graham. I left the opera house that night thinking to myself that I liked the opera and hoped to see it again, and that Renée Fleming would be a star, and I knew I would see her again because it was such an extraordinary performance. I agreed with Sir George Solti, who said of her, he said, "In my long life, I've met maybe 2 sopranos with this quality of singing. The other was Renata Tebaldi." So I have 2 requests. One is that you turn off your cell phones, and the other is that there's no picture taking, okay? So cell phones, no pictures, and the final invitation is to please join me in welcoming Renée Fleming. I just want to say that normally when it's just me on stage, everyone is at the back of the room. With you on stage, everyone's in the front of the room. It's kind of magical. Welcome to the Opera Center.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Wonderful.
You know, and forgive me, I have a standard question I always start out by asking, and that is, who brought you to your first opera?
I think my first opera that I remember was Suor Angelica, and it was because my mother was actually performing Blanche. So I remember so well the 3 of us, my siblings and I, sitting right in the front at the Eastman Theater in Rochester, New York, and her, you know, singing Senza Mama with tears streaming down her face, looking at her 3 little children. Oh. So, you know, that was an indelible impression.
Now, your career took off like a rocket. Houston in 1988, Seattle in 1989, the Richard Tucker Award in 1990, the Met in 1991. Do you remember the last audition you had to sing? And I asked that because Flicka was here. The first time that Flicka was in the Opera Center, she was seeing people going in for auditions, and she looked at me and she said, "Thank God I don't have to do that anymore."
Right. No, you know, it's funny because you say it took off like a rocket, and for me there was a dead zone. There was a really painful dead zone between being a student and things really actually starting. You know, because I was in my late 20s already, so it was, to me, it felt like it was taking forever. But once I got the first Figaro in Houston, then things went very quickly, it's true. And it's because I was singing the Countess and not too many people wanted to do it at that point. So there was space for me. The last auditions, I don't remember the actual last one, but I didn't have to audition, you know, too long, it's true. And in my sort of catch-22 remark all these years has been that the minute you stop auditioning or get good at auditioning is the minute you don't need to anymore.
Yeah, I suspect that's very true.
Yeah.
In my introduction, I mentioned your performances in Maria Padilla in Omaha, The Ghost of Versailles at the Met, and actually that season you sang Countess as well, which was a sort of accidental debut.
Right.
But those 3 pieces, in a way, defined so much your career of rarely performed opera, masterpieces, and new work. And how has this variety fed you as an artist?
Well, I've always loved new music. And in fact, I recently had a distinctive memory of the record LP jacket of Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf. And I found it online, exactly which version it was, because I think I wore it out as a very little girl. I played it over and over and over again. And I suspect, knowing now what I know about the music and the brain, that this fed my taste. So, because I've always been more interested in music that was a bit unexpected, that didn't quite have an obvious resolution. And so that definitely is the new music piece. And the masterworks, I mean, really it went from Mozart to Strauss, I mean, no question, with you know, a little bit of Slavic repertoire and a few Italian roles, a lot of French. And then, and I would say for the obscure roles I did a lot of unusual repertoire, that's true.
And I assume that preparing roles is very different, whether it is something that is of historical Baroque nature, something that's new and has never been performed, so that you have no performance practice at all and you have to invent the character,
right,
versus a masterpiece where there's such a history of it.
Yeah.
Is it very different for you preparing for these different kinds of works?
I rather liked the ones that don't, where there isn't this template, because one feels freer. You know, I'm not trying to measure up to anybody else's performance. And then also working with a living composer was, of course, the greatest gift of all, because they could tailor make the role to my voice. And you know, the biggest issue for me was that my particular instrument was so specific, you know, that I couldn't sing the heavier heroic repertoire, and yet I wasn't really a coloratura soprano either. So just finding that sweet spot for me was challenging, you know, and it's made it also probably a bit hard for other people to kind of get a handle on who I am, vocally speaking, where opera is concerned.
But certainly that variety has certainly fed your spirit, deepened your artistry as you have found mastery in each of these different spheres.
Well, I think I've sung about 55 roles, something like that, and I definitely like the variety of it. I'm not a huge repeater. I don't like doing the same thing over and over and over again.
Do you recommend variety to young singers who ask you for advice?
No, and in fact, that's not a no. But I'm saying that because nobody's asked me they asked me how to learn repertoire. They asked me a lot about the preparation and sometimes about choosing, but nobody's ever asked me that question, actually.
Because and the variety is not only staged opera, but also the variety that you do in recital, that you do recital and staged opera. Again, feeding you creatively, how does that work?
Well, Leontine Price said when I met her, "You're a three-pronged singer," and I had no idea what she meant, and she meant, you know, concerts with orchestra, opera, and recitals. And I thought, doesn't everybody do that? And when I met her, she said, no, actually they don't. Not everyone does do that. So there's no question that I've really enjoyed the variety a lot. And another interesting thing, when I was starting out, there was this notion that new music was bad for your voice, that the sort of quality of new music would hurt your voice, and instead you should all sing Mozart. And I thought, it's the opposite for me, because Mozart and the repertoire that I sing is incredibly challenging for young singers, because it all sits in the passaggio, and it requires a certain almost a clarity and a perfectionism that's very hard for us early on, whereas new music, for me, allowed me to move freely through the voice and never get too hung up or stuck. So, go figure.
Were you blessed with perfect pitch?
No, good relative pitch, but never.
But you had to sit there and plunk it out and really learn it.
Yeah.
In terms of the recital work, there you are without costumes, without a set, without a stage director who says, move here, move here. Is it more challenging to plan your own mise en scène, to plan your own program, to be alone with your clothes and the audience?
I find it a huge challenge. Programming takes years off my life. It's just, it's hard. I'm a perfectionist with it. I want everyone in the audience to be happy and to take something away. And so I suffer a lot over programming, and you can ask my management, they suffer too. And the presenters suffer, you know. But, oh, can we please have the program? So, and it's about wanting to have variety, really thinking about where I am, you know, what city, imagining, and also stretching myself, you know, trying to incorporate new things but not making it too stressful. So you asked a good question, because it really is hard. But I love it. I mean, I love it because I can create, you know, I'm going to Asia soon. I can sort of think about, well, who do I want to be on this trip? I haven't been there in a while. What parts of my repertoire do I want to share with this audience, from Hong Kong to Seoul to Beijing and Shanghai? And then also, I'm touring Europe right after this with 4 last songs. So obviously that's probably the piece I've sung more than anything at all, by far.
It's nice to know you're slowing down so much.
Yeah. Exactly.
You know, a generation ago, the leading singers of the day didn't do new music. And part of it was there wasn't that much new opera to do.
Right.
And then it just wasn't something that the major singers wanted to do or thought they should do. Today it's so different, where you think of all of the leading artists and they're all creating roles.
Yes.
What has changed that's just turned it completely around?
Well, and I love to think back a century when everything that a singer sang was new. So it hasn't been that long that we've been stuck in this repertoire that's been repeated for decades now. And I think what changed is, first of all, the audience. I mean, I know that me, as an audience member, was longing for some variety and some novelty in a way. And I also, I think that there became that we had some popular composers also who were able to write music that the audience enjoyed, that was vocal, that was written to work very well for singers. That's made a huge difference, I would say. And I don't, whatever the elements are, I'm thrilled. And then we have this burgeoning small work scene between, you know, Beth Morrison projects and a lot of people doing shorter pieces.
Yes.
That I love that. I mean, I think that's the most hopeful sign of a healthy opera landscape.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how it is helping to break down barriers for audiences. Indeed, your advocacy for new work applies even at Lyric Opera Chicago, because the project Bel Canto, Jimmy Lopez's opera, is one that you really shepherded.
Yes.
And I'd love to hear how you put that project together, and then what it was like to essentially birth an opera you weren't in.
Well, you know, first of all, I love new music, so I'm always listening to new works. And I discovered in that process, I mean, I put together a spreadsheet of about 110 composers, and I realized that that's the tip of the iceberg. So, I focused then on American composers. And the idea was to look for people who had craft, who could orchestrate, who really could put the piece together, but who also had a unique language, you know, and one that would be, you know, not accessible in a sort of overly romantic notion, but that the audience would be able to have a takeaway from it. So that was sort of the criteria. And then once Anthony and Sir Andrew agreed to Bel Canto, to actually choosing the subject and then choosing the composer, which is of course rare, then it seemed to make sense to focus on somebody who could represent a Latino world. You know, sort of, you know, the actual hostage crisis took place in Peru. I just sang the voice for Julianne Moore for the film, which is coming out this year. So Bel Canto lives on, and it just turned out really well. And I didn't want to sing it because I said then it looks like a vanity project. It looks like, oh, look at Renée Fleming. She you know, got this new work produced so that she could create a role. So I specifically didn't want that to happen to the piece.
Did you go to workshops? Did you watch the work develop?
Absolutely.
And
Emilio Cruz, the librettist, I was in the sessions that he had to try and help him sort of comprehend how an opera breaks down musically speaking, what set pieces are, you know, why this might be a good quartet, why that might be a nice duet. So it was a really fabulous learning experience also for me.
then, of course, it was telecast on PBS, which is a fantastic final achievement for the piece.
Yes.
And Jimmy has a wonderful, wonderful musical vocabulary, and I hope he's working on another opera.
Yes, me too, me
Yeah.
too. And I would love to see Bel Canto perform more, so I'm hoping it gets picked up.
You've performed in so many important American operas. Has any of them gone across an ocean? Have you performed any of those American operas in Europe?
Streetcar Named Desire, I sang in London.
Mm-hmm.
The same semi-stage production that I brought here to Carnegie Hall,
Right.
Lyric Opera and LA Opera. That's the only one.
Do you feel that the American opera aesthetic, the way we are creating new works today, is an aesthetic that translates across the ocean, or is it really an American aesthetic?
I think it does now. I would say there would be room for sure now for some of the new works. I mean, if you think of John Adams' Dr. Atomic, and this type of language would be extremely popular in Europe, I think. And just as some of those works are coming over here, because the language is becoming a little more global, I would say, between Thomas Addis and some of the composers that we have. It's not quite the split that it was even 15 years ago. You would point to American music as being a little bit perhaps too reactionary for a European audience, and European music being really too inaccessible for an American audience. I think that's changed.
And you mentioned Beth Morrison projects. I know you're involved with National Sawdust, which is just a wonderful space out in Brooklyn. These works are really testing the boundaries of how we have defined opera. And given your repertoire, one might think that those traditional boundaries would be ones that you'd want to enforce, but you really like these boundary-breaking works. What is it about that creative edge that appeals to you?
I do. I mean, first of all, it's theater. It becomes then theater with music and with singing. So it's really that the focus is slightly different. They're shorter. They're in a way smaller accompaniment. Also, you don't see full orchestra usually. So I love that there are more works then. There are many more of them. You can have a festival. The danger that I see is that I fear that companies will not want to produce main stage opera in its full, a kind of larger form, and that I think would be unfortunate.
Yeah, it is a real issue that we discuss at our annual conferences. You could come to our annual conference next week in Dallas, actually, where there's so much work that's being done for alternative venues and chamber works that you don't want to escape doing the new work for the big stage,
No.
as you did, of course, with Bel Canto.
Yes, and I think there's risk. I mean, no question. I suspect that is at the heart of one of the probably the issues kind of feeding into this. But and also another thing is the companies have found out that they can produce 2 or 3 of these smaller works as opposed to one big work. So we have yet to this has yet to settle into something consistent.
And of course, the new works are frequently about topics that resonate with the world we live in.
Right.
And it was...
It's complicated.
Yeah,
Getting more complicated.
A complicated world for sure. And it was, your assistant Paul said something I liked a lot in an email yesterday. He said, so many operas are about doomed young girls.
Yes.
And if you think about the standard repertoire and the condition of women and the treatment and their victims, and their only solution is to jump or stab or do something.
Right.
And I think in many ways, Handel and Mozart, the reason they still feel so contemporary is because the women are real three-dimensional characters.
I know, it's incredible, isn't it?
They're so contemporary. So I imagine that you'd like to see some more new opera with strong female characters.
Yes, absolutely. And I have to say also, for me, one of the issues that I face as a lyric soprano is there's almost no repertoire for me at this stage of my life. It doesn't really work for me to play a 19-year-old anymore, as much as I wish it did. So yeah, I think that's one of the issues that we face. And had my voice gotten heavier and I could have moved into more dramatic repertoire, there would be certainly pieces. But that's the other thing is why should a mature woman be, a witch or a, or one of these characters that is sort of, you're either a victim or you're evil. I mean, this has been sort of the woman's crisis in opera. And, and I think 100 years ago, life expectancy, I think, was around 50. So So perhaps performers just didn't have long careers. I don't know.
It was Amy Burton who said to me, we have to encourage the librettists to create the stories that the composers will set that have strong women in them.
Yes. This is why we need more women composers and more women librettists. So that will solve that problem.
Absolutely. We have the program for female composers. We have to get one for female librettists. That would be terrific.
Yes.
The issue of resonance with today's audience, and I know that you think a lot about the opera audience, and that opera is challenged in having these perceptions of being inaccessible. We know it's long. You know better than any of us that it's long. So when you look at opera and the opera companies today and the opera audiences, what do you see as some of the challenges to bringing new people in?
Well, I think first of all, people still to this day, every time I'm in front of a camera or in an interview that I know is going to be received by the general public, I still have to say you can wear jeans and there are super titles, because the I get this all the time, and maybe it's an excuse so that people don't think they have to try it. But I often receive the, oh, it's a foreign language and I wouldn't know what to wear. So still. And I think length is an issue. My husband won't go to a movie until he's checked how long it is. So, and a ton of new people have been coming to see Der Rosenkavalier. People have never been to the opera, and I always poll them afterwards, and that is the first thing that comes out is, couldn't it be consolidated? So, and we've talked about this, I do think a lot of these pieces were earlier in the 20th century, and why couldn't we somehow present both? And give the audience an option. So I think that's important. I think the larger theaters are also difficult, because we are now, my entire generation and all of us are so used to being able to see everything in HD close-up. And so just an oral experience with a very distant, blurry picture is sort of not what we're used to anymore. But most importantly, and number one, because my children and their friends are the next generation, and they receive everything in a digital package. And they are used to having access to any kind of entertainment they want to have 24/7. And if it's not part of that, they are less inclined to get involved, I think. So that's the main thing that we face.
Over lunch the other week, you were talking about how your daughter also just goes in with groups of people, that the progressive evening, and with groups of friends.
She loves this sort of app that has a parlor concept, that you're going to different venues, you don't know what's going to be presented. It's very often storytelling, sometimes there's music, there's usually wine, and it's social, which is exactly how we should be presenting opera.
And as Renee says, the complete, unabridged versions are a fairly recent reinvention. The operas that we know so well and love, and the singers we loved in them, sang much shorter versions of them. There were always cuts and trims.
Yes, definitely. You didn't always have a da capo. You didn't always have extended recitative. These pieces were composed at a time when there was no other form of entertainment really, other than the secular at home or the sacred. And so it is beginning to be obvious to some of us that times have changed. Our lives are moving very quickly, and frankly, everything has to evolve in some way. So this is one option, I think, that's kind of interesting.
I think it's so important that we have someone of Renee's stature as an artist being willing to talk about the bones of the art form itself, and how do we work with those bones to make compelling audience experiences. Your producers will get shot down. You're the artist who can speak for where opera may need to go to appeal to a new audience.
Well, and the first company that does that is going to definitely take a hit. It would have to be a consortium, I think. And then, this is something Opera America could do, for instance, with companies that would say, yeah, we're on board with trying this. And there are I believe firmly that you could put the greatest opera in the world on stage, and you're not necessarily going to get new people in, because that is preaching to the converted. This is people who are going to come are people who were already going to come. So what we've tried to do at Lyric Opera is bring in people through other means, whether it was Second City Guide to the Opera, or Chicago Voices, which was about blending different styles of singing together to bring us back into the conversation about voice. This started with American Idol when my daughter said, "Mom, you know a lot. How come you're not involved in this? Why aren't you a coach or something?" I said, "I don't know." Why aren't I?
I was going to ask you, because you have the Kennedy Center American Voices,
right,
and Lyric Opera Chicago Voices. And would you share with us what these events are and how genre bending they are?
Well, my idea, because I love singing, I'm so passionate about singing and all styles, was to bring people together from all these different genres and have us not only perform together, but have master classes and panels, really looking at the business, looking at vocal health, why have so many artists had surgeries in recent years, and trying to sort of see where we can share what we know. So when I do it again, it would be a team teaching effort. I mean, for instance, Kurt Ellings, great jazz singer, gave a 30-minute presentation on how to learn how to sing scat. And I said, wow, that's fantastic. And it was so articulate and well done. So I also, the first time with American Voices, there were doctors who presented that and just being there has improved my vocal health. I learned so much. So that's why I do it.
And these are community-based singers, professionals, mixed together, community and professional?
It's basically professionals who come in. In Chicago Voices, they were all major Chicago names. Okay. Jesse Mueller, for instance, joined us, and Kurt. And then for the master classes and the panels, a lot of young singers, teachers, and come and join and come and participate. So, it's an opportunity to really share what we know as well.
And rooted in your belief that singing is that universal communication platform, and that if you get people to understand and appreciate singing,
right,
then the door's open.
Absolutely. And everyone can sing. It doesn't cost anything. And the effect of these shows, American Idol, The Voice, etc., America's Got Talent, I saw in my children's schools, which was that you had a whole generation of young people who could sell a song like crazy. Mm-hmm. They'd kick their shoes off, take the mic off the stand, really whip the whole chord, the whole thing, but they couldn't sing. Mm-hmm. So I said, so they have this tremendous sort of, and we were terrified when we were kids. We could hardly move. I mean, I was called Stone Face when I was in choir, but there was a rigorous musical and vocal education, even in public school then. So that's sort of the idea behind it, is how to share this knowledge. I mean, we have centuries of really best practices mm-hmm. behind us. Just even with breath and support alone, it's very helpful.
Musicals. So important in Chicago, important in your own life with the announcement of your going back to Broadway.
Right.
So clearly you feel musicals are a valid, wonderful art form. Do you also see them as a bridge into opera, or just as this wonderful thing on its own?
Well, one of the reasons why when I started at Lyric Opera, one of my initiatives was to present American classical musical, is because I did feel that it was a bridge. It certainly was a bridge. Bonnie Raitt told me that John Raitt, her father, when he retired, kept singing German Lieder around the swimming pool. And when I asked her why, she said it's because that's how he was trained. And he came back to it for fun when he retired. So, and that connection is less now because there's so many other styles mm-hmm. of Broadway performance, including rap now. But certainly for Rodgers and Hammerstein and some Lerner and Loewe shows, it's still helpful to have that kind of training. So it's made sense to connect the two, and I think other opera companies are also doing the same now.
Sure, and you're absolutely right. Those pieces were written for the unamplified voice.
Yes.
And young singers who went into that would suddenly discover they had an opera voice because of what was required to sing the musical.
Yeah, interesting. I also found it fascinating recently to discover there's a generational gap as well, because some fans who've been around for a long time have really been shocked that I'm going to do this musical, and said, "Do you have to?" And I
mean, 2 homes now, Washington and New York.
I know. I think they literally meant, "Do you need the money?" Yeah. So, but it made me understand that there was this idea that it was a step down, and that is so gone now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is absolutely not the case anymore. And if anything, it's an opportunity to reach another audience, and for me, it's an opportunity to be home for a while. I'm looking forward to that.
You've done Broadway before. What's it like doing 8 shows a week?
Well, it was a brief time. I didn't have time to get tired, really, for Living on Love, which was a play about an opera star. But it was really fun. It's such a different feeling, because we are perpetual nomads. Even if we see colleagues that we know and love, we're gone again and off to the next engagement. And in this case, you're with the same people in a rehearsal process, and then, for 6 days a week. Yeah. So I really enjoyed it. Now, a musical's going to be different because it's singing, and we'll see. We'll see.
You talk about being on the road, being a nomad, and I certainly do speak with other guests here about the rigor of being a successful opera singer.
Oh,
and
yeah.
You're not only a successful opera singer, you have just risen to the top of the field historically. You're always in an airplane, you're always in a hotel. It's got to be really difficult to enjoy the success when you're away from home all the time.
The last 2 years have been especially hard because I was on a plane every 3 days, pretty much. And I don't think I would do that again, because it's sort of not worth it at a certain point. But I love what I do so much. The possibility to connect with an audience, and mostly the thing I love the most, I think, besides kind of putting together a program that I hope they will enjoy and respond to, and you get that instant feedback, is also I talk to the audience and try to share my personality and share some thoughts about why I love certain music, and to discover that there's this sort of communication process that really does help everybody have a good time. Just enjoy it and enjoy it and love the music, whether it's Henri Dutilleux's piece or a very obscure Czech aria. It seems to be helpful.
In that spirit of giving advice, when there are young promising singers, you see them all the time. You've done master classes, we'll talk about that. Mm-hmm. What advice do you give about how to live your life as a busy opera singer?
Well, singing right now with Erin Morley, for instance, in Rosenkavalier, a brilliant young soprano who had a baby just a couple of months ago. And it's reminded me of having to kind of make that work at the very beginning of your career and how that happens. And it is a challenge, and it's a balancing act, but it's so worth it. And I'm happy to see her doing that, so she'll never be sorry. So I tell them honestly, what the challenges are, but I think the first challenge is getting work in the first place. So that's where I start. So,
yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Do you enjoy doing master classes?
Yeah, I do.
You're very good at them.
I do them a lot, thank you. Now I do them increasingly more because I have more time when I travel. But I see so many young singers all across the country. And that's one of the things that I do worry about is they have these degrees. I've also been in department stores in regional cities and seen somebody burst into tears when they see me. And they say, oh, I was trying to become a singer, but I had so much college debt, I had to stop. And so that, I think, is really sad. So. And
we've mapped it. There are just more and more singers. There are more university opera programs that are larger, more young artist programs. And that's why there are so many of these indie opera companies is many of the artists are just using their wits and the internet to create their own performance opportunities.
Right.
It's very difficult.
It's the best way to do it. I mean, Yo-Yo Ma is somebody I so admire, and he often makes a case for going into a community and saying, well, you don't know this, but you need me, you know, and creating work for yourself, exactly.
I wanted to chat a little bit about your work as an artist citizen, a citizen artist. And I attended the Art Summit last year when you were there with Yo-Yo.
Right.
And really talking about the life of the artist as a citizen, having impact in the community outside the walls of the Opera House.
Right, right.
Clearly something that really matters to you. What about that work fulfills you?
Well, first of all, I know so many young people who are doing it more and better than I ever have done it. I'm just so impressed from a young age that they start giving back and doing community service and really sharing their talent. So I'm doing it now by working with these institutions and trying really, not just audience development, but trying to sort of define why we need the arts at all. You know, what it is about us as human beings, as really a community in America that benefits from having the arts. And the thing that I keep coming back to is this idea of a shared experience. We're all here together right now, and otherwise we'd be at home, you know, watching television or, again, hooked up to something plugged in. And I think that that's one of the most important aspects to this, is that in an increasingly isolating type of community life in this country, we need the arts more than ever.
I was remembering, it was this week, the sitting Surgeon General left the administration, and
wasn't he great last
year? He was fabulous. I wanted to bring that up. He was just wonderful.
We were all bowled over.
On this wonderful panel, and was that the panel you led, I think? Or maybe Yo-Yo did, one or the other.
I don't remember.
And it was the Surgeon General speaking about the importance of the arts to the well-being of the individual. And the psychic, emotional well-being that is so critical. He was brilliant.
Yeah, and going around and also helping students and learn how to meditate. I mean, a lot of sort of things that we haven't heard from a Surgeon General before.
You're working with the NIH in the partnership with the Kennedy Center.
Right.
Could you tell us a bit about that?
So my idea for this came about, you know, I've been interested actually in music in the brain by being a New Yorker and seeing, you know, once a month something in the Times about some new piece of neuroscience that really started to be fascinating to me. And I was at a dinner party and Francis Collins was there, who's the head of the NIH. And this was right after two huge decisions by the Supreme Court. It was a very small dinner party outside of Washington, and Justices Ginsburg, Kennedy, and Scalia were all there, having just really clashed in this decision. They weren't making eye contact with each other, but they came, which is a fabulous example for our culture, that they still came. And so Francis and I decided to start singing together to sort of, you know, break the tension a little bit and just sort of get everyone to relax. He had his guitar, and while we were doing this, and I was trying to think of every single folk and country music song I knew.
Knew by heart.
Yes, exactly. We discovered that, you know, I asked him about this interest, some of these studies, and I said, wouldn't it be wonderful if these two institutions could collaborate in this way? So this has turned into a spectacular expansion of a program they had, where already the NIH has had a workshop inviting many of the top researchers and music therapists together to present for 2 days. I got to sit there just being bowled over by what I learned. And then June 2nd and 3rd, it's about to be announced, we'll have an NSO concert with me and Ben Folds. Dan Levitin, who wrote This Is Your Brain on Music, will host, and we'll have two other major neuroscientists and doctors present as well. I shouldn't say too much because it hasn't quite been announced. And then the next day, a whole day of seminars. So touching on children, childhood development, touching on music therapy and how these various therapies impact on so many different issues, but autism and Alzheimer's, pain relief, PTSD, stroke, I mean, it's remarkable, Parkinson's, and then also about creative aging and how it's so extremely good for the brain and for our health, emotional health and physical health, if we stay connected to something we love, whether it's singing in a choir, which is also good for your immune system, or playing an instrument, picking it back up again. And I've found this extremely fascinating.
It is so frustrating because there is so much rich literature about this available, and none of us has time to read it. You know,
Yeah.
that if
Yes.
only we could get everyone to read the research,
Right.
I think public policy would perhaps be a little bit different.
Well, it's bubbling under the surface, and I'm hoping that we can continue to kind of push this message out that this is good for us. And with health and wellness being the biggest growing industry in our country, whether it's hospitals or caretaking, should be a big part of it.
So many artists we know live in the world of their virtuosity, and we understand why. It's not easy to be a virtuoso. It takes focus and discipline.
Right.
And yet here you are stepping out of your comfort zone as a virtuoso into the world of public policy and public programs that support people, not just opera people. Do you feel that artists have a responsibility to have impact in the community beyond just their art form?
I don't think it's a responsibility. I feel it's a privilege because I've been given this opportunity to do this, and it's so stimulating. It's enjoyable for me because I'm learning, and I'm the kind of person who's going to be a lifelong learner, and you should all be too, because again, it's so good for us. So no, I don't think it's a responsibility because not everyone has that personality, and some people really want to live in their art and just are so focused on what they're going to learn next and where they're going to perform it, and that's great too.
As you think about this transition in your career and your rebalancing, what advice do you have more generally for those entering the field about balance, about dedication, focus? What advice do you have for those young singers who are listening to this interview?
Well, I mean, first of all, longevity is a function of your own balance. It's a function of how well you take care of your voice, your vocal hygiene, how the smartest choices that you make in terms of repertoire and your schedule, even your emotional health in terms of your private life. So first of all, just to get them to the place where they can sing for a long time is huge. I mean, I am, there isn't so much repertoire for me at the moment in opera, but I spend 80% of my time touring and have for quite some time now. And Leontine Price, she sang for another 15 years beyond where I am right now. So that's my goal, is that in fact, my schedule isn't changing very much at all. And I hope that young singers have a long-term idea. And none of us do. When we're young, we want everything right now. I was so disappointed, when I was in my mid-20s that it wasn't happening in that moment. I had to wait till 28. Come on. And so patience, hard work, resilience, these are some of the qualities that I talk about when I'm teaching.
How fabulous. There's a screen over there that puts up questions from people who are watching on the live stream. And one was about your, as you experience singers in Europe versus American singers, the relative level of preparation, the difference between the young American singer and the young aspiring European singer.
What I hear most when I'm in Europe is that American singers are good students. So the level of preparation is very high, but the courage, the interpretive, taking that bull by the horn, and sort of also personality are not on as high a level as one finds with European singers. And I think that's changing also very quickly now. But it's true that we have a longer education. It's a rigorous education. And within that education, based on how it's set up, we're encouraged to fit into these, kind of a structure that's consistent. Whereas in Europe, I think there's just not as much, they don't spend as much time in school and conservatory as we do. So they get out quicker, and they're also, let's face it, many of them are singing opera in their native tongue, in a language that they already know well, whereas we have to take so much time to learn those languages, the styles, all of that. I saw the same thing when I went to China. I said, it's not that different. Somebody from the Midwest who's never been outside of the country has a tougher road than somebody who's in Europe who's traveling all over and speaks maybe 6 languages already.
Right.
But again, with the internet, of course, which gives us access to native speakers in terms of listening to music, it helps.
Now, in all of our emails back and forth in our conversations, we've never talked about K-12 education, because you mentioned education and the diminishment of European arts in education. Is that something that you have talked to people about what we need to do to try to keep music in the schools? And it doesn't have to be just European music, but music. So kids are learning rhythm and learning pitches. Right. Have you spoken to any people in the policy circle about that?
I haven't yet, and so one of the things that I'm learning from this NIH project, of course, is that there's no doubt now, studies have proven across the boards that music education, learning an instrument in particular, helps children become better students. They have a better capacity for auditory understanding and comprehension, and this idea of trying to coordinate something between your hand and your brain also helps the brain develop. And another thing that I heard recently from a chairman of a board of a major arts institution is that he said when he interviews CEOs in the finance world, and he says, how many of you studied an instrument in music? Almost all of them raise their hands. We know that's true in medicine. I mean, any of us who love music and or are musicians, we just think, gosh, there's so many doctors who love music. How did this happen? Or studied it? And another conductor told me recently, and also astronomers. I thought, well, there's a piece of trivia I'm going to keep with me. That's good. So there's no question, I think. The other interesting thing I learned in basic science is that we now believe that music predated speech in our evolution. So that tells you we are hardwired for this. And I haven't researched the other arts, and I'm sure there's a lot of power in movement, in dance, and also in the visual arts.
Very diplomatically put.
Well,
we know music is best. A few years ago now, I chaired an important high school reunion. And what was interesting was the high proportion of the people at the reunion who had been in the chorus or the band or the drama department, because performing and rehearsing together and practicing together created a bond.
Right.
And those people felt tied to one another. And the same with sports, the sports people as well, that they felt tied to something and created something with their colleagues that was bigger than just themselves. And it was a special bonding in the K-12 setting.
Well, and community, really any kind of community theater. I mean, wouldn't it be great if every opera company had a sort of division where people could come and actually perform who love the art form? I think it's fantastic.
Amateur opera's hard. You could have an amateur symphony and choruses, of course, lots of amateurs. It's hard to sing La Boheme as an amateur. It doesn't work quite as well.
People do it, though. You could have karaoke night, and you'll get a sense of what's out there.
Well, if we go to karaoke night, I want to go with you.
There we go.
We have just a couple of minutes left, and I thought perhaps if we bring the house lights to half, that we can take a question or two for Renee. I see a hand back there. Stand up, tell us who you are, and what's your question, please.
Hi. I read your book, and I've seen many interviews that you've given, and you speak so eloquently about the technical aspects of singing and so eloquently about the artistry. And I'm wondering if you could just give us like an indulgent moment to describe your own voice, the way you feel it and the way you hear it.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. So I don't hear what you hear. Obviously, I'm hearing, it's sort of my inner ear. So what I am focused on is interpretation. So what I hear is, what was the shape of that phrase, and was I able to bring out the text in the way that I wanted to, and what was the inflection? And the fun that I had, for instance, in the performance last night, I had this gift of doing 3 things that I'd never done before. it's called inspiration. It's called flow, being in the zone. And there were 3 moments when I actually, whether it was an activity or a way of singing a word. So I thought, oh, that was new. And this is the ideal, is that something is so much in your voice that you are expressing it as if it were a play. And you're in the moment as much as you can be. So when I'm singing something, but this is declamatory, it's a lot of text. But if I'm singing something that's purely vocal, that's about beauty, that's about a particular phrase or a turn of phrase, then I'm thinking about a landscape. So I see my vocal line as a sort of a landscape, with as if you were drawing it.
In our quick-fire questions before the audience came in, Richard Strauss came out as really sort of being at the top of the list for you. You feel his characters, you feel his music. Is it a combination of character and music that speak to you so profoundly?
Well, the roles that I've done of Strauss, with the exception of Daphne, which is a huge vocal hurdle, are, I think, 3 generations of the same woman. So I do think that Arabella, the Countess, and the Marschallin have a lot in common. They're more interesting, they're more complicated than other operatic characters, and you don't always know what they're thinking. You have to kind of piece it together for yourself.
How wonderful. When I interviewed Susan Graham, she was talking about her life, and she said, there were years where the only person I kissed was Renée Fleming in bed waiting for the curtain to go up on the first act of her. Oh, there.
I know. Listen, that's a testament to the sadness of our travels.
She said we'd be in bed while the overture's going in. How are the kids? How's everybody?
By some miracle, we're both happily married now. But
that's
it's a miracle.
Another question.
Right.
Sir, right here.
Hi.
Hi.
My question concerns the growth of a singer and the evolution of the repertoire. How much can a singer stretch and grow and work into fuller repertoire, and how much of that is predetermined by genetics?
I think it's absolutely predetermined by genetics. We hear people speaking voices, and you have a sense of very often the type of power that they'll have, but not consistently, not always. My speaking voice is terrible. I don't think it sounds, you wouldn't even know I was a singer, I think, my speaking voice. So, and I do see singers who clearly have worked hard to create a technique that gives them the most power they could possibly have. And then aging adds another whole element. I mean, who would predict that Placido Domingo would still be singing baritone repertoire as well as he does as a tenor, as a young tenor. So I think it's very hard to know. You will know. I feel that if I'm pushing my voice, I feel it. It doesn't feel great, and I don't like having the pressure to sing loud all the time. I don't enjoy singing like that. I like finesse. I like to see, I'm much more interested in that. So the answer to your question is, I don't really know, but if it's pushed outside of the realm of the nicest quality sound you can make, then I would say it's probably gone too far. But that's me. A lot of people are happy just to make a big sound and sing the rep they want to sing.
What great advice that is. Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard from a master singer, from a great artist, from a great intellect, someone taking on public policy issues and seeking to bring opera outside of the opera house in every way that it can benefit the world we live in. It is so impressive to hear you speak and to realize that we have decades of your leadership, both as an artist, as in a public figure. So in a busy week, Rosenkavalier last night, interviews all day today. Renée Fleming, thank you so much for being here.